Hi, I'm Tiffany. Most of us are taught from very early on to absorb things quietly, to keep the peace, to be the one who lets it go, who finds a way to understand, who decides that the relationship matters more than the thing that was done. Today's story is about a woman who spent 36 years being that person for on, and what happened the night she decided she was finally done. Let's begin.
My name is Sandra Kowalski. I am 36 years old, and I have spent the last 8 years writing the same book. We send it to someone who can actually help you, my parents said. You should be grateful. The manuscript had 412 pages. My sister's name was on the cover. My grandmother's journal was listed in the acknowledgments. I did not call them back. I called an attorney. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up a file I had not touched in 6 months, a file that still carried my name in the author field, created March 14, 2016, last modified November 2, 2023, 412 pages, author Sandra Kowalski. If you have ever built something, over years, something real and private, and someone you trusted decided to take it, without asking, stay with me. This is what happened. This is what I did about it. I should start from the beginning, which means I should start with my father. Ray Kowalski is a practical man. He has been practical his entire life, in a way that was never cruel and never unkind, but was always, without exception, immovable. He spent 31 years as a mechanic in Aurora, Colorado, working at the same shop, from the time he was 23, until the day he retired. He understood things that had weight. He understood things that broke and could be fixed, things you could hold in your hand, and estimate the cost of repairing. The garage at our house on Sycamore Avenue always smelled like motor oil, and metal shavings, and the particular dusty warmth of a space, where someone has worked long and carefully at the same task for years. When I was a child I used to sit on the concrete step at the garage entrance, and watch him work. He moved with a kind of economy I have never seen in anyone else, no wasted motion, no uncertainty, just the precise sequence of actions needed to bring a broken thing back to working order. I admired that. I still admire it. It simply was not a language that had room for the kind of work I wanted to do. When I was 22 years old, a junior in a communications program at Metro State, I told my father I wanted to be a writer. Not a journalist. Not a copywriter or a technical communicator. A writer, the kind who tells true stories about real experience, the kind who tries to put language around the shape of a life in a way that makes another person feel less alone in their own. I told him this at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening in October. My mother was washing dishes. My sister Tess, who was 17 then, was in her room, with the door closed. My father set down his coffee cup and looked at me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of a man who has been given information that is technically his concern, but practically outside his capacity to fix. He said, "Writing does not pay rent, Sandra." That was the entirety of his response. No lecture that followed, no conversation, no second sentence. Just that one, delivered with the finality of a diagnosis, and then he picked up his coffee cup again. I was young enough to believe that a practical man's certainty was evidence. I was old enough to feel the weight of that sentence in a way that did not leave. I did not argue. I did not cry, at least not in front of him. I enrolled in the technical communication track the following semester, and told myself it was a reasonable compromise. I was not wrong that it was reasonable. Technical writing paid better than almost any other writing-adjacent career I could have chosen. By the time I was 24 I had a full-time position at a mid-size medical device company in the Denver Technology Center, writing FDA-regulated documentation. Instructions for use. Risk management files. Validation protocols. The kind of writing where every word carries regulatory weight, and every version has to be logged, with a timestamp, and an author field, and a record of every change made since the last approved draft. I was meticulous at it. My manager told me in my first performance review that I had an unusual instinct for knowing exactly which detail mattered, and which could be simplified. I thanked her. I did not tell her that I had spent 4 years learning to recognize the difference between precision and ornamentation in a writing program that I had only enrolled in as a substitute for what I actually wanted. In the evenings and on weekends, I wrote. Not the FDA documentation. The other thing. I started the memoir in March of 2016. I had just turned 28. My grandmother Ruth had been dead for 2 years, and the grief had settled into something that was less sharp than the first year, but more present in a way I had not expected. Less like a wound, and more like a room in the house that I could not quite bring myself to use for anything else. I started writing because I wanted to put down what I remembered before it blurred. I wanted to record the specific texture of who she was, not the general impression of a beloved grandmother, but the actual particular woman, the sound of her voice, when she was telling a story she had told before, the way she held her coffee cup, with both hands in the morning, the yellow linoleum in her kitchen, yellow squares with a thin blue border, worn pale at the spot in front of the stove, where she had stood every morning for 40 years. I did not tell my parents I was working on it. I told myself that was because I wanted to finish a draft before sharing it. That was true for the first year. After that, I think I was protecting something I could not name yet. Ruth had given me my first journal when I was 14 years old. It was a hardcover, brown leather, slightly larger than a standard notebook, and she had written on the inside cover in her careful cursive, the handwriting of a woman who had learned penmanship in an era when it was taught seriously. She wrote, "Your stories deserve to be read, Grandma Ruth, 2002. I was 14, and I had not yet written anything that deserved to be read by anyone." She was writing ahead of what I was, into what she believed I was going to become. That distinction has mattered to me my entire adult life. Someone who sees you as a future tense does not stop seeing you when the future takes time. Ruth died in the spring of 2014. She was 79 years old. She had a stroke on a Wednesday morning and was gone by Saturday. I drove from Denver to Colorado Springs, where she lived, and I sat with her in the hospital room during the days between, and I held her hand, which felt smaller than I had ever registered it feeling. She did not regain consciousness enough to recognize me in those last 2 days. I have thought about that. I have thought about what it would have meant to be able to tell her that I was writing, that the journal she gave me was full, and had been replaced by other journals that were also full, that her belief in the 14-year-old was not misplaced. I did not get to tell her that. I got to hold her hand, while she did not know I was there. That has to be enough, and mostly it is. The memoir started as something I was writing for her, or for the version of her that still existed in my memory. A way of completing a conversation that the stroke had interrupted. In the first year I wrote mainly about childhood, the summers the first spent at her house in Colorado Springs, the way she taught me to make pierogi from scratch using a recipe she kept in her head, because her mother had kept it in her head, and writing it down would have felt like admitting it could be forgotten. I wrote about the smell of her house in July, dry heat and something floral I could never identify precisely. I wrote about the way she listened when I read to her from the journals she had given me, sitting in the armchair by the window, with her hands folded, not interrupting, not suggesting, just listening in a way that made you feel that what you were saying was worth the time it took to say it. She was the only person in my family who listened to me like that. I did not understand, until I was an adult, how rare that quality is, how many people go their whole lives without having a single person who listens to them, as though what they are saying actually matters, and is not simply waiting for their turn to respond. Ruth listened. She had opinions, strong ones, and she shared them, but she always listened first. The memoir grew out of trying to put language around what it felt like to be listened to like that, and then to have it gone. By 2018 the manuscript was 160 pages. I had shown sections to 2 people in my online writing group, a woman in Vermont, who wrote personal essays, and a retired teacher in Oregon, who was working on a memoir of his own. People I had never met in person. People who had no stake in my family, no history with my parents, no reason to tell me what I wanted to hear instead of what was true. Their feedback was honest and careful. They said the voice was specific in a way that was unusual. They said the detail about the kitchen felt like being there. They said keep going. Around the same time I made the decision to share chapters with my parents. I am not sure what I was looking for. I know what I told myself I was looking for, which was their input on accuracy, whether I had remembered certain events the way they remembered them, whether there were details I had wrong. I think what I was actually looking for was permission. Some acknowledgement that the project was real, that the years I was spending on it were not wasted, that they could see what I was building, and they thought it was worth building. My mother read the first 3 chapters, and called me a few days later. She said it was very detailed. She said some of it felt quite private. I said yes, that was the point of Memoir, it was by nature personal. She said she supposed so, and she moved on to asking about whether I had been to the dentist. My father did not comment directly. At the next family dinner he said, well, at a moment, when I had not asked him anything, and then he stopped, and then he reached for the bread, and that was the entirety of his literary criticism. I kept sharing chapters. I am not proud of that, looking back. I kept offering the work to people who had made clear they did not have the vocabulary to receive it, and I kept being surprised when they did not receive it. There is a particular kind of hope that is indistinguishable from stubbornness. I had it for several years. In 2019 I finished a draft I considered strong enough to query. I submitted to 2 literary agents, both of whom represented Memoir, both of whom had recently sold books that I thought were comparable to mine in scope. Both rejected the manuscript within 3 weeks. Rejection is normal. Rejection is part of the process, and every writer knows this, and knowing it does not actually make it land any differently. What stayed with me was not the rejection itself. What stayed with me was the language. Both letters mentioned that the narrative lacked a clear commercial hook. Both suggested the author consider the marketability of the subject matter. The phrasing was similar enough that I read both letters side by side, and felt a faint, unspecific unease that I filed away without examining. I told myself that agents often used similar language, because they were drawing from the same set of industry standard concerns. I told myself the problem was in my execution, not my concept. I spent the next year revising. I rebuilt the first 3 chapters from scratch. I joined a second writing group focused specifically on Memoir. I worked on it every evening, sitting at my desk, after dinner with my laptop open, and the document on the screen, and the specific silent focus of a person who has nowhere else to put a certain kind of energy. In 2022, my parents mentioned almost in passing that they had gone to dinner with a friend of Tessa's, who was involved with a small press somehow. My mother said it was a birthday dinner for Tess. She mentioned it between other topics, the way you mention weather or traffic, a piece of information, with no particular weight attached. I said that sounded nice. That was the entire conversation. I did not ask follow-up questions. I had no reason to. Tess had always known people adjacent to the arts, through her years working in bookstores. I filed the information in the same category as everything else my parents mentioned in passing at family dinners, and moved on. By October of 2023 the manuscript was 412 pages. I was tired in a way that felt fundamentally different from the tiredness of the previous years. Not the tiredness of effort, which I had come to know well, and which had its own kind of satisfaction underneath it. This was a different kind. A hollowness. I had been working on the same project for 7 years. I had revised it 3 times in substantial ways. I had a document with 412 pages of my own memory in it, organized and reorganized, shaped and reshaped, every sentence chosen from among other sentences I had tried and discarded. I decided to take a break. I closed the file on November 2nd of 2023 and made a deliberate choice not to open it for at least 30 days. I lasted 23 days. On the 23rd day, on a Tuesday evening in late November, I was sitting on my couch scrolling through my phone, when a notification came through from one of my writing group accounts. A member had tagged me in a post. The post said, "Congratulations to your family, your sister's book. Is this based on your family stories?" There was a link attached. I clicked it. It was a listing on a small press website. The cover image showed a title I did not recognize. The author name was Tess Kowalski. The description used phrases I had written. Not paraphrased. Not inspired by. Phrases I had written, verbatim, in a document I had closed 23 days earlier. I read the listing 3 times. I set my phone face down on the couch cushion. I sat very still for a long time. Then I got up, and went to my desk, and opened my laptop, and started typing, into a blank document, not the memoir, not a message to anyone, just typing, because that was the only thing I knew how to do, when I did not want to feel the full weight of what I had just seen. I did not call my parents that night. I did not call Tess. I sat at my desk, until well past midnight, with the laptop open, and a blank document on the screen, typing sentences and deleting them, not because I did not know what I wanted to say, but because saying it would make it a thing that had been said, and I was not ready for that yet. Around midnight I got up, and went to the closet in my bedroom, where I keep boxes of old journals. I found the brown leather journal that Ruth had given me when I was 14. I carried it back to my desk, and set it on the closed laptop. I did not open it. I just looked at it. The cover was worn smooth at the corners, from being moved through 4 apartments, and the spine had a small crack near the bottom that had been there since my 20s. I did not need to open the cover to remember what was written inside. I had read it enough times, over the years, that I could see it without looking. I sat there, with the journal in front of me, and I thought, through what I knew. I thought about the 2 options available to me. The first option was to do nothing immediate. To assume there was context I did not have, to call my mother in the morning, and listen to whatever explanation she offered, to find a way to absorb this, that did not require me to become someone who did something about it. I was familiar with this option. I had practiced it for years in smaller situations, every time a comment was made about the writing being too personal, every time my father's non-response was the only response I got. I knew how to process things privately. It was one of my more reliable skills. The second option was to treat this the way I would treat any document problem at work. In my job I dealt with version control issues regularly. When a document appeared in our system, with authorship or dating inconsistent with the actual history of the file, you did not assume it had worked itself out. You opened a formal inquiry. You gathered the source files, established the audit trail, traced every version back to its origin. You did not operate on goodwill when the record was unclear. I am a technical writer. I have spent 12 years working with documentation systems built on the foundational premise that the record matters, that timestamps tell the truth, that version history does not lie. I had a file on my hard drive with 7 years of tracked changes in it. I knew who the author field named. I knew what the creation date said. I closed the blank document. I searched my contacts for Miriam Flores. I had met Miriam 4 years earlier in my first writing group. She was a few years older than me, methodical and precise, and she had mentioned once, without making a point of it, that her legal practice focused on intellectual property. I had filed that information away, and never needed it until now. I typed a short message. I said I had a situation involving a manuscript, and I believed I needed legal counsel. I said I was sorry for the late hour. I sent it, before I could revise it, into something more measured. Then I closed the laptop, and put Ruth's journal on my nightstand. I did not sleep well that night. But I slept. Miriam called me at 7:45 the next morning. She said she had read my message, and she wanted to hear the full situation, before saying anything. We met at her office that afternoon. It was a small office on the second floor of a building in Capitol Hill, bookshelves on 2 walls, a rubber plant by the window, that looked well cared for. I brought my laptop. I brought a printed folder with the rejection letters from 2019 and a screenshot of the small press listing. I sat across from her desk, and I started from the beginning, and I did not stop until I had said everything I knew, which at that point was a listing I had not known existed, a title I did not recognize, a description that used sentences I had written, and my sister's name on a cover, where mine should have been. Miriam listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked whether I had a copyright registration on the manuscript. I said I did not. She asked whether I had the original files, with timestamps intact. I said yes, everything, going back to March of 2016. She said, "Good, that is what matters." She explained the legal situation in plain language, without softening it, and without dramatizing it, which I appreciated, because it was exactly the register I needed. She said copyright in the United States attaches to a work at the moment of creation, not at the moment of registration. Registration is evidence of the right, not the source of it. What mattered was establishing that I was the original author, and the way to do that was through documentation. File metadata showing creation date and authorship. The track changes log showing every revision, over 7 years. Emails and correspondence that placed me in contact with the manuscript over time. Anything with a timestamp and my name on it. She said, "You have 7 years of digital footprint on this document. That is not a small amount." She told me to go home and pull everything I had. She told me not to contact my parents or my sister until she had a clearer picture of what the press had actually received and under what circumstances. I went home. I opened my laptop. I did not feel anything identifiable in that moment, which I recognized as a sign that I had moved into the part of myself that manages things rather than feels them. I have that part. I have relied on it at various points in my life, and I do not entirely trust it, but that evening it was useful. I pulled the original manuscript file and opened the properties window. Created March 14, 2016. Last modified November 2, 2023. Author, Sandra Kowalski. Last modified by Sandra Kowalski. 412 pages. The track changes history showed 3 distinct revision cycles, the first running from March of 2016 through the fall of 2017, the second from late 2018 through 2019, the third from 2021 through 2023. Each cycle represented months of concentrated work. I exported the full track changes log. It was 230 pages by itself. I pulled every email in my sent folder that contained the manuscript file as an attachment. There were 37 of them, sent to writing group members over 7 years. Each one had my name in the from field. Each one had the manuscript attached, with the file name and date. I printed the rejection letters from 2019. I read them again, with a different kind of attention than I had given them at the time. I made a folder on my desktop and labeled it with the date. This is how I manage things. I make them into documentation. I make them into a project with a folder structure and a version history, because that is the only container I have that is large enough to hold something I cannot yet afford to feel directly. 2 days later, Miriam called. She had contacted the small press and requested copies of their submission agreement and any correspondence related to the manuscript. She had what she needed to tell me something definitive. The press had received the manuscript in the spring of 2022. The submission had come from an email address belonging to my mother. In the submission email, my mother had described the work as a memoir written by her older daughter, and had explained that her younger daughter Tess would serve as the public face of the project, because the actual author was a private person who did not wish to be identified publicly. I asked Miriam to repeat the last part. She did. I sat with it. I thought about the word actually. Written by her older daughter. She had written that. My mother had written those words to a publisher and sent them. Meaning she knew whose work it was. Meaning this was not a confusion, or a misunderstanding, or a gap in communication, that a single phone call could have closed. She had known exactly what she was submitting, and she had submitted it anyway, and she had left my name off the cover anyway, and she had done both of those things deliberately, with full knowledge of what she was doing. Miriam said she had also found something else. She said that in the submission email, my mother had written an additional line. She read it to me. My mother had written, "My daughter Sandra wrote this. Her sister Tess has agreed to be the public face. Sandra is too private." I asked Miriam to read it again. She read it again. I processed what that meant. My mother had written, in an email to a publisher, a sentence that confirmed my authorship of the work, in plain language, with my full name attached. She had written it, as context, as explanation, as a way of helping the press understand the arrangement she was proposing. She had written it, without any apparent awareness, that it was also a document, that would outlast her intentions. She had handed Miriam the central exhibit in the case, without meaning to, and without knowing it. I spent that week in a particular state I recognize now, as a kind of controlled dissociation. Functioning clearly in the external register, doing the job, eating meals, sleeping with reasonable regularity, while something underneath ran a parallel process, that I did not have full access to. I went to work. I wrote documentation for a catheter insertion guide, and a revision to a risk management file for a product that had been on the market for 6 years. I sat in a meeting about a validation protocol, and contributed twice, and could not have told you afterward what I had said. I came home in the evenings, and sat at my desk, and worked on the evidence folder. It was the most organized grief I have ever experienced. The folder grew. Every document I found went into it. Every email, every draft, every tracked change. The folder became a kind of record not only of the manuscript's history, but of the years I had spent working on it, the evenings, the weekends, the writing group sessions, the revisions, the rejections, the rebuilding. Looking at it was like looking at a version of my own life organized by date and file type. I had given those years to something real. The record proved it. The record was the only thing that could not be argued with. I sat at my desk for a long time after that call. I did not open my laptop. I did not type anything. I sat at the kitchen table, with a glass of water I was not drinking, and I thought about what it meant, that my mother had written those words. I had always understood my mother as someone who acted from a particular kind of certainty. Not cruelty, not malice in the conventional sense, but the certainty of someone who has decided they know better, and who has organized the available evidence to confirm that conclusion. She had looked at 7 years of evenings I had given to the manuscript, and she had decided that her version of what was good for me was more reliable than my own. She had made that decision and she had acted on it, and she had told the press, in her own words, exactly what she had done. There is a kind of damage that is harder to repair than damage that comes from people who know they are causing harm. When someone hurts you deliberately, there is at least a clean line to stand on. When someone hurts you, because they believe completely that they are helping you, the line becomes harder to find. My mother believed she was acting in my interest. I am as certain of that as I am of anything. She looked at a private woman who had spent years writing something too personal to share, and she decided to share it for her, with a face attached, that would absorb the public part, with the privacy intact in the way she thought I needed it intact. She believed this was protection. She believed, I think, that I would eventually understand. That is the sentence my mother told Tess. She will understand eventually. She was still waiting for me to become someone who would agree with her about what had been done to me. I just sat there looking at the folder on my desktop, with the date on it, and I thought about the 7 years of evenings that folder represented, and what they had been worth to the people I had most wanted them to matter to. A few days later I was searching an old backup drive for additional early drafts, when I found a folder I did not recognize. It was labeled, with a date in the spring of 2022. Inside were several documents. One of them was a version of my manuscript I had never seen before. It was my manuscript, unmistakably. Same structure, same chapter sequence, same narrative voice. But certain passages had been lightly reworded. Certain identifying details had been changed. Someone had gone through the work carefully and methodically and made changes that were small enough to look like editing, but deliberate enough to create distance between the version on the screen and the version in my original file. I sat looking at that folder for a long time. Then I opened my laptop and I started typing, not into the manuscript, not to Miriam, not to anyone, just typing any words at all, because I needed to be doing something with my hands while I absorbed the full scope of what I was looking at. I forwarded the folder to Miriam that night. She called the following morning and said, "This changes things." She said, "Whoever created this version was not acting impulsively." She said, "This was planned." I asked what it meant for the case. She said it meant we had more, not less. The existence of a deliberately altered version, created after my original, only strengthened the chain of evidence. It demonstrated intent. It showed that someone had sat with my work and attempted systematically to put distance between what was published and where it came from. The source was still there. It had always been there. It had a creation date and an author field, and 412 pages of track changes, with my name attached to every single revision. I printed the metadata report that night. Not because I needed a printed copy. Because I needed to hold the paper in my hands. Because I needed the information to have physical weight, to exist in a form I could put on the desk in front of me, and look at, with both hands on the surface. The first page listed the file name, the creation date, the author field. Author, Sandra Kowalski. Created, March 14, 2016. I put my finger on that line. I held it there for a moment. Then I added the page to the folder. Miriam filed the copyright registration on a Friday morning, using the earliest dated file in my possession, the original draft, from March of 2016. The registration would take several weeks to process fully, but it established our claim, with a date that predated the press's submission by 6 years. She said we would send an initial letter to the press the following week. Not a cease and desist yet. A formal notice of competing authorship claim, accompanied by the documentation package we had assembled. The metadata report. The tracked changes log. The email correspondence, with writing group members, over 7 years. The submission email my mother had sent, with the sentence about Sandra wrote this. The copyright registration filing number and date. Miriam said, "We are giving them an opportunity to understand the situation, before we require them to respond to it formally." She sent the letter on a Monday morning in January. The press responded in 4 days. 4 days is not nothing. Organizations do not respond in 4 days to notifications they consider without merit. Their reply was carefully worded, the language of an entity that has recognized a problem, and is not yet certain of its dimensions. They said they were reviewing the matter internally, and would be in touch. Miriam told me that was a good sign. She said organizations that have no exposure do not use language like that. I went back to work. Going back to work was the right thing to do. Not because the work distracted me, though it did, partially, but because the work was a place where the rules were clear. A document is either compliant, or it is not. A version history is either accurate, or it is not. The standards are published and fixed, and the stakes are regulatory and verifiable. I found that clarity useful during a period when almost everything else in my life was unclear and unverifiable. I sat at my desk and wrote instructions, and tracked changes, and logged revisions, and I was very good at it, and that was enough. At lunch I sometimes ate alone at my desk rather than with the team in the break room, because I did not have the bandwidth to manage casual conversation, while also managing everything else. My coworker Danielle asked me once whether I was okay, and I said I was dealing with a family thing, and she nodded in the way people nod when they are giving you permission not to say more, and I was grateful for that nod. I went to the grocery store, and the pharmacy, and the car wash. I maintained my life at its regular dimensions. I did not tell anyone outside of Miriam what was happening. Not friends, not former writing group members, not the coworker, who had asked. Partly because the situation was still legally active, and I was following Miriam's advice about keeping the circle small. Partly because I did not yet have language for what had happened, that did not sound, when I rehearsed it in my head, like something too large for normal conversation. My parents stole my memoir, and published it under my sister's name. That sentence was true. It was also the kind of sentence that, said aloud in ordinary settings, made people look at you, with a particular expression, the expression of someone who is deciding whether to believe you, and is not entirely sure they do. I kept the sentence to myself. I wrote documentation for a new catheter delivery system. I tracked changes on a validation protocol for a revision to an existing product. I logged versions, with timestamps and author fields, and revision histories in the same system I had been using for 12 years. My manager asked me once, that month, whether everything was all right. I said yes, I was just tired. She nodded and did not press further. I was not lying exactly. I was tired. Tired is a word that covers a lot of different conditions, if you do not look too closely at it. My parents called once during those weeks. My mother called on a Sunday afternoon. I looked at the phone, and let it go to voicemail. She said she wanted to talk. She said she hoped I was doing well. She said she thought we should find a time to connect. She did not mention the book. She did not mention Tess. She did not say anything that acknowledged the existence of the situation we were both aware was developing. I listened to the voicemail twice. I did not call back. 3 weeks after Miriam's first letter, the press requested a call with her. I was not on the call, but she briefed me thoroughly afterward. The press had done an internal review. They had arrived at a conclusion they were not willing to state plainly, but that their questions made unmistakably clear. They wanted to know whether I intended to pursue a formal legal claim. Miriam said yes. They asked whether there was room for a resolution that did not involve litigation. Miriam said that depended on what resolution meant to them, and she would follow up with specifics after speaking with her client. She called me that evening. She walked me through the options as she saw them. I told her what I wanted. I said I wanted my name on the work. I said the record needed to be correct. That sentence, said out loud to a lawyer in a small office in Capitol Hill on a January evening, while snow was starting outside the window, was the clearest I had been about what I wanted from the whole process. Not punishment. Not an apology, though I would have taken one, if it had been offered sincerely. Not a dramatic confrontation, or a public accounting, where my parents had to stand in front of people they knew, and say what they had done. The record needed to be correct. The author field needed to have the right name in it. The book that existed in the world, with my words in it, needed to exist, with my name attached, or not exist at all. Those were the only things I was asking for. They seemed, in the way that obvious things seem obvious once you have said them aloud, like the minimum a person was entitled to ask for, when something they had made had been taken from them. I said I was not primarily interested in financial settlement in the first instance, though I understood that might be part of what a resolution looked like. I said, the record needs to say who wrote the book. She said understood. She went back to the press. In February, the press sent a formal acknowledgement that the submission materials they had received contained information inconsistent with the attribution on the published work. They did not admit fault in those words. But they had moved. I could feel the movement even through the careful language. That acknowledgement was the press doing what cautious organizations do when they have decided that the cost of continuing is higher than the cost of resolving. They were not admitting anything in the legal sense. But they were signaling that the position they had taken when the book was published was no longer a position they were prepared to defend at full volume. That signal mattered. Miriam said, they are looking for a way out that costs them as little as possible. She said, we are going to let them find one, but we are going to make sure the terms of finding it are ours. I asked her what that meant in practice. She said it meant the settlement would require formal acknowledgement of authorship in writing, with my full name, and that acknowledgement would be part of the permanent record. Not a private agreement that said nothing publicly. A documented correction that established the record correctly. I said that was what I wanted. She said she knew. She said, that is also what we are going to get. In late February, Miriam told me that the press had a book signing scheduled for early March at an independent bookstore in the Highland neighborhood of Denver. Tess was scheduled to appear. The acquisitions editor, who had worked on the manuscript, would be there. Local writing community, family, friends, neighbors. The standard audience for an event like that. Miriam said, if we serve a cease and desist to the press before the event, they will have a decision to make in a very public context. She said, I want you to understand what that means for everyone in the room. I said I understood. She paused for a moment, and then she said, there is also the matter of your sister. I said I knew. I had been thinking about Tess for weeks. I had not spoken to her since before the night I found the listing. I did not know the full shape of what she had agreed to, or what she had understood she was agreeing to, or what she had been told. I did not know whether she had participated in this willingly, or whether she had been walked into something she could not back out of. I did not allow myself to examine that question too carefully. If I examined it carefully enough, I would find reasons to hesitate, and I was not in a place where hesitation was available to me. I told Miriam to prepare the cease and desist. She filed the paperwork on a Thursday. The document was formally served to the press on the morning of the book's signing, 4 hours before the event was scheduled to begin. I thought about Ruth's journal on my nightstand at home. I thought about the yellow linoleum in Ruth's kitchen, the worn pale spot in front of the stove. I got out of the car. I walked to the bookstore. 2 days before the signing, Miriam had sent me an email with a document attached. It was dated in October of 2022, several months after the original submission had been sent. Tess had written 12 words. Mom, I told you this would hurt her, you said she would understand eventually. That was the entire message. I read it several times. I sat with what 12 words could contain. For 3 months I had been building a picture in my head that was clean and navigable. Parents on one side. Me on the other. A clear wrong and a clear correction. Tess had been part of that picture, placed on the side of the people who had taken something from me because she was on the cover, and because I did not know what else to do with her. 12 words rearranged the picture. She had said this will hurt her. She had known what was being done. She had said to my mother directly that it would cause harm. And my mother had told her that I would come to understand eventually. And the project had moved forward. Tess had not stopped it. She had not called me. She had not found a way to warn me. She had sent one email, and then she had been the name on the cover, and the face at the press events, and the person scheduled to sign books on a Thursday afternoon in March. I do not know what was brought to bear on her to keep her in that position. I know she is 5 years younger than me. I know she has always found it harder than I have to hold ground with our parents. I know my mother has a particular way of translating someone else's compliance into an act of family loyalty, a way of making the person who goes along feel that going along is love, and not going along is selfishness. I know these things. I held them. They did not change the cover. But they changed the picture I had been working with, and that change was not small. I had spent 3 months building a case against my entire family. I had organized the evidence methodically. I had not let myself hesitate. And 3 months in I found out that one member of my family had been quietly on my side the whole time, and had not had the capacity to do anything about it. That distinction mattered. I did not know what to do with it mattering. I did not call Tess before the signing. I thought about it. I sat in my apartment the night before with Ruth's journal on the nightstand, and I thought about picking up the phone. But I did not know what I would have said. I did not have language for a conversation that held both "I know you tried" and "you were still on the cover." I put the journal down. For the first time in 3 months, I did not open my laptop. I just sat in the quiet. That was the hardest night of the whole period. Not the night I found the listing, not the night I found the altered draft on the backup drive, but that night, the night before the signing, when I had to hold something complicated, and did not have a folder to put it in. The bookstore was warm and full when I walked in. There were perhaps 40 people inside. More than I had expected for a Thursday afternoon in early March. The kind of crowd that a local event draws, when enough people care about it, when enough people have been told about it, and decided it was worth an afternoon. I recognized some faces immediately. 2 of my parents' neighbors, from the block on Sycamore, a couple who had been coming to family barbecues since I was in high school. A woman I recognized from Tessa's coffee shop, a regular customer, who had always been kind to her. Several people I did not know, carrying tote bags, and wearing the specific look of people who take literature seriously, and show up to local events to prove it. The acquisitions editor was standing near the back of the room, beside the signing table. He was in his mid-50s, lanyard around his neck, a clipboard in one hand. He had the look of someone who had been briefed on a complication, and was waiting for it to arrive. The cease and desist had been served that morning. He knew I might come. My parents were at the signing table. My father was standing, with his hands in the pockets of his jacket, the posture of a man who has been asked to be somewhere, and is fulfilling the obligation, without knowing how to be present in it. My mother was arranging a small stack of books on the table, straightening them the way she straightens things, when she is managing something internal. Tess was behind the table. She was wearing a blue cardigan I recognized, the one she had worn at Christmas 2 years earlier. She was talking with someone near the end of the table, holding a pen, nodding. She looked up when the door opened. She saw me. The expression she had been holding shifted. Not disappearing, just changing register, moving from the surface version she had been maintaining to something that understood the afternoon was different now. The acquisitions editor saw me at nearly the same moment. I do not know how he knew who I was. Perhaps Miriam had sent documentation that included identifying information. Perhaps the press had done their own research. Perhaps he simply knew what a situation looked like when it was about to clarify itself. He crossed the floor toward Tess, with a speed that was precise and unhurried, the speed of someone who has decided what needs to happen and is doing it. He said something to her quietly. She looked at him. She looked at me. She set the pen down on the table. My mother noticed the movement at the table. She turned from the stack of books she had been arranging, and looked toward the door. She saw me standing just inside the entrance, with my coat still on. She went very still. Not the stillness of shock, exactly. More the stillness of a person who has been carrying a weight for a long time, and has just been told it is time to set it down, and is not certain her arms will know what to do without it. My father turned a few seconds later. He looked at me. Then he looked at the acquisitions editor. Then he looked back at me. His expression was one I had not seen on him before. It was not anger. It was not even guilt, not quite. It was the expression of a practical man, who has just reached the edge of a situation that practicality cannot fix, and who understands for the first time that he has been practical in a direction that led here. I did not walk to the table. I did not make a speech. I had not come to make a speech. I had come to be present, to be in the room, to exist in the same space as the event at the moment the event became something other than what it had been planned as. I stood near the entrance, and I let the room be what it was. There was music playing, something low and acoustic, from a speaker near the register. A small table near the door held a stack of the book, a sign with the event details, a pen cup. I looked at the cover of the book. It was a plain design, dark blue with the title in white. I thought about Chapter 7. I thought about the yellow linoleum and the worn pale spot. I thought about whether the designer had used that chapter as the source for the cover image, or whether it was a stock photograph chosen for tone. I looked at Tessa's name below the title. I looked at it for a moment. I thought about the fact that she had looked at this cover every day since the book had been published, and that every day she had looked at it she had known what she had told our mother in October of 2022. I thought about what it costs a person to carry that kind of knowledge. I thought about it with something that surprised me in that moment, which was something close to compassion, not the kind that changes what needed to happen, but the kind that sees a full person rather than only the surface of what they did. The acquisitions editor was speaking to Tess in a low voice. I could not hear the words, but I could see Tessa's face, and I could see the moment the full scope landed. She looked down at the books on the table. She picked one up, and then set it back down. She looked at me again, with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment for a long time, and has mixed feelings about it finally arriving. One of the neighbors, the woman I recognized from the barbecues, turned to my mother and asked quietly what was happening. My mother did not answer. She looked at the books. She looked at me. She opened her mouth and then closed it. That was what the collapse looked like for my mother. Not a scene. Not raised voices or tears or dramatic confrontation. Just the absence of words in a person who had always had words ready, who had spent decades knowing what to say to smooth any surface, standing at a table in a bookstore, with nothing available. My father did not say anything either. He looked at the floor for a moment, the way he sometimes looked at an engine, when the diagnosis was worse than he had hoped. Then he looked up at me. Not asking for anything. Not defending anything. Just looking, the way you look at something, when you have finally stopped arguing with what it is. I have thought about that look since. I have thought about what it meant for a man who spent 31 years fixing things that were broken to stand in a bookstore at an event that had just become unfixable and look at his daughter with an expression that had no repair plan in it. There is nothing in a mechanic's training for that moment. There is no tool for it. I do not know what my father felt in that room. I know what I saw on his face, and I know what it was not, which was indifference. Whether what I saw was guilt, or grief, or simply the recognition of consequence, I cannot say with certainty. I do not know my father well enough to read that distinction on him, and I am aware that not knowing him that well is one of the losses that led directly to the afternoon I am describing. The event did not continue. People began to understand that something had happened before they arrived, something that had changed the structure of the afternoon. The writing community members near the bookshelf started quiet conversations. The neighbors near the entrance began moving toward the door. The press staff member, who had been managing the event, spoke briefly with the acquisitions editor, and then stepped away to make a call. Tess remained at the table. She did not look up as people left. She sat with her hands in her lap, and the unsigned books in front of her, and she kept her eyes down, and she stayed very still. I stayed for perhaps 10 minutes. Then I put my coat on, which I had never taken off, and I walked back, through the door, and down the block to my car. The press pulled the book 4 days later. Miriam called me when it happened. She was matter-of-fact about it, which was the right register. She told me what the settlement terms would look like. Formal acknowledgement of authorship. Removal of the published work from all distribution channels. Return of any advance that had been paid to the submission party. She said the copyright registration was verified and active in my name. She said the manuscript was mine, and the record would reflect that. I thanked her. She said, "Call me if anything else comes up." I said I would. I sat at my desk, after the call, and looked at the folder on my desktop. The one I had labeled, with the date the night I found the listing. I looked at it for a while without opening it, Then I looked at the manuscript file next to it. Created March 14, 2016. Author, Sandra Kowalski. I did not open it. I just looked at the file name, and let it be what it was. My father did not call. In the 6 weeks that followed the signing, he did not call once. I do not know whether this was because he had nothing to say, or because he had too much, and did not know how to begin. With my father, those two things have always been difficult to distinguish. My mother sent 3 text messages over the same period. The first said, "You could have just talked to us." The second said, "We were trying to help you." The third said, "I hope you understand how much this has affected your sister." I read all 3 of them. I read them more than once. I did not respond to any of them. I do not say that is something I am proud of. I say it because it is what happened. I did not have language for a response that was honest and also civil, and I decided that silence was better than the alternative. I still do not know if that was the right decision. I have thought about what a different version of me might have done. A version who called my mother back and had the long conversation. A version who went to my parents' house and sat across the kitchen table and said, "Tell me why you thought this was something you could decide." I think about that version sometimes. I think about whether that conversation would have produced something that the legal process did not. An explanation I could believe in. An apology that was specific enough to mean something. Some account of the decision-making that helped me understand how a person gets from "my daughter works too hard and is too private" to submitting her work to a publisher without telling her. I have not been able to construct a version of that conversation that ends in a place I can stand on. Maybe that is a failure of imagination. Maybe it is a reasonable assessment of the materials available. I do not know. What I know is that the record is corrected. What I know is that the manuscript has my name on it again in every system where it exists. What I know is that when I open the file now, the properties window says what it has always said. Created March 14, 2016. Author, Sandra Kowalski. That is a fact. That is a fact that belongs to me, and that cannot be submitted to anyone else's press, and reattributed to someone with a more public-facing personality. I find that I need to start there. I find that I need to hold that fact clearly before I can hold anything else. The manuscript is on my desk now. Not open, just present. A file icon on a screen in an apartment I moved into in September, in a neighborhood I chose, because it had a park 2 blocks away, and a coffee shop that opens at 6 in the morning, and no particular associations with the person I was when I started writing it. I had been thinking about what it would mean to send it out. Not to agents who might have received a competing version through channels I did not control. To new agents with a clean history, with a copyright registration dated March 14, 2016, with 412 pages, and a cover letter that says, "This book took 8 years to write." I do not know yet if I am ready to do that. I know that the question feels different now than it has ever felt before. It feels like a question that belongs to me. That is new. 6 weeks after the signing, I met Tess for coffee. Her suggestion, a message sent on a Tuesday morning, short and careful, just 2 lines asking if I would meet her. We went to a place in Capitol Hill that neither of us had any particular attachment to. Neutral ground. We sat across from each other with our cups, and neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Tess said she was sorry. She said it simply, without a long preamble, without building a case for herself first. Just, "I am sorry." I said I knew she had tried to stop it. I said I had read her email to our mother. She looked down at her cup. She said she should have called me directly. She said she knew that was not enough. I said no, it was not enough, and it was also true, and both of those things could be true at the same time. We did not resolve anything that afternoon. We did not arrive at a new understanding, or establish a new normal. We sat for an hour, and then we paid, and we left separately, and I walked back to my car in the cold. That conversation is still the last one we have had. I do not know what we are to each other now. I am not ready to know that yet. My manuscript sat on my desktop unopened for 4 months, after the settlement. I was not avoiding it. I was not afraid of it. I think I needed it to be unambiguously mine for a period, before I could open it again, without the case still active in my head. In July I opened it. I read the first chapter. It was better than I remembered in some places, and rougher than I remembered in others, and it was mine in every sentence, in the specific details, that only exist, because I had been in those rooms, because I had stood in that kitchen and looked at that floor. I closed the file, and sat with that feeling for a while. I have not sent it to an agent. I have not made a decision about what I want to do with it. That part of the story is still ahead of me, and I am in no hurry. I have been asked, by the one person I told the whole story to, before making this, whether I think I handled it correctly. Whether the legal route was the right route. Whether there was a version of this, that did not involve a cease and desist served 4 hours, before my sister was scheduled to sign books in a Highland bookstore. I have thought about that question carefully, because it deserves a careful answer. I think the legal route was the correct route given what the alternative was. The alternative was absorbing it. The alternative was calling my mother, and listening to an explanation, and finding a way to accept a version of events in which what happened to my manuscript was something other than what it was. I have spent my adult life being the daughter who absorbs things. I have spent my adult life developing the skill of making my parents' limitations comfortable by limiting myself in parallel with them. The manuscript was the first thing I refused to limit. The legal process was the first time I treated the evidence of my own experience as something that mattered enough to defend in a formal register. I do not think that was wrong. I think it was, in fact, the only thing I had done in 36 years that was completely consistent with the sentence Ruth wrote in a brown leather journal when I was 14 years old. What I decided very early in this process, before the cease and desist, before the settlement, before the coffee with Tess, was what I was going to keep and what I was going to let go. I was going to keep the record correct. I was going to keep my name in the author field, where it belonged. I was going to keep the manuscript on my hard drive in the folder, with the date on it, and the 412 pages in it, and the creation date, that says March 14, 2016. What I let go was the version of my parents I had carried for 36 years. The version where their limitations were a form of love I had not yet learned to translate. That version served a purpose for a long time. I do not think it is useful to me anymore. I still have Ruth's journal. When I moved out of my apartment in September, I packed it, before anything else. Before the boxes of books, before the kitchen things, before the extra blankets. The journal went in first. It is on my nightstand in the new apartment now. I have not opened it in months. I do not need to open it to know what it says. She wrote those words to a 14-year-old, who had not yet written anything. She wrote them as a promise about what was coming. About what the girl at the desk would eventually make. I believe she would consider the record corrected. I believe she would consider the account settled. Whether the people, who were supposed to witness, that are capable of seeing it, that is a question I have stopped trying to answer on their behalf. If you have ever trusted someone, with something you spent years building, and they decided the thing mattered more than the trust did, I hope this has been useful to you in some way. I hope you know that the documentation exists. I hope you know that the author field remembers. The timestamps do not lie, and they do not forget. Neither do I.